many things historians look for when evaluating the historicity of an ancient document is the contemporaneousness of what's being written, meaning how close in time was a given document written in relation to the events it's describing. So a document written a month after a given event is generally believed to be more reliable and accurate than a document written, say, 15 or 35 years after that event. All things being equal. In terms of the documents claiming to detail the life, death, and alleged resurrection of Jesus, the Gospel of Mark is generally believed by scholars in the field to be the first of the four Gospels. But Mark is not our earliest source. There's another, the Apostle Paul, whose writings predate all the Gospels. Christian excusegist Mike Winger, my apologies, made a video titled "Skeptics Wrongly Claim Apostle Paul Didn't Know Jesus." I'll link to that video below so you can watch for yourself. I'll just say that Mike makes some really good points, which we'll go through here briefly. But clearly, as Mike shows, Paul knew quite a bit about Jesus. Why wouldn't he? Paul was not only getting revelation from Jesus, but took the A train to downtown Jerusalem and met with two of our main man's OG apostles, Peter and James, where one would imagine that Paul got the skinny on all kinds of goings-on pertaining to Jesus and the life he led, both before his death and those 40 days after his resurrection, where he was hanging out and chowing down and ultimately making gravity his bitch. Excusegist Mike takes us verse by verse on a magical mythery tour, demonstrating that Paul knew a ton about the big J. Paul knew Jesus was born of a woman. He knew that Jesus was a servant to the circumcised. Aren't we all? He knew that Jesus was perfect. Not sure how he knew that, but yeah, okay. That Jesus was a descendant of David and Abraham. He knew that Jesus appeared to Peter and the 12, because apparently that whole story about Judas hadn't been made up yet. Paul knew the creed of the early church. He knew Jesus was made in the likeness of men, that Jesus had brothers, that Jesus performed the Eucharist. That's the sacrament for my Mormon viewers. Paul knew that the Jews killed Jesus, or rather the Romans. Whoops. Paul knew that Jesus was brought before Pontius Pilate. He knew Jesus' teachings on divorce and taxes. He knew Jesus taught that nothing is unclean. Paul even knew portions of the Sermon on the Mount. Mike is right. No ifs, ands, or buts about it, and until the end of this paragraph. Paul knew quite a bit about Jesus. And again, it's important to note that Paul is our earliest source, what historians would generally view as our best, most reliable source, all things being equal, someone who spent time with the Big J's OG apostles, Peter and James. So, of course, Paul was going to know quite a bit about Jesus. But did you notice anything interesting in Mike's list, the list of things Paul knew about Jesus? Because I did, and it's pretty damning. If you're looking at Mike's list, you have to be at least a little surprised that Paul seems to know nothing of the miraculous life and ministry of his visionary leader. Beyond the resurrection and the creed, Paul is clueless about the mystical, magical, supernatural Jesus of the Gospels. In fact, Mike starts out by saying that Paul knew Jesus was born of a woman. Not a virgin, but a woman. Rather unspectacular, don't you think? Yeah, God's #1 evangelist showed no signs of knowing anything about the glorious, miraculous origins of his Savior. So apparently that meme hadn't hit ancient Twitter yet. Excuse me, ancient X. Paul knew nothing of the birth narratives, from the Magi to the angels to the slaughter of the innocents, or any of the claims Matthew and Luke made about the miraculous circumstances of Jesus' birth. which means he couldn't possibly have known how irreconcilable those competing narratives are. Though we can all rest assured that Paul's parents likewise made the trek back to their hometown from 1,000 years ago for that wacky Roman census. Think about this for a minute. Paul was getting revelation from Jesus himself, and he met with Peter and James, who would have had all kinds of amazing stories to tell, faith-promoting stories. And yet the greatest salesman in the world never once mentioned any of that to his customers, or rather flock, or parishioners, whatever you want to call them. Paul, our earliest source, never tells anyone of the virgin birth, of Jesus raising the dead, his walking on water, the miraculous feeding of the 5,000, or of people rising from their graves upon Jesus' death and checking out all the local shops in downtown Jerusalem. Imagine someone dead for hundreds of years asking you, how much for that gourd?
4? For this gourd? 4? Look at it. It's worth 10 if it's worth a shekel.
Even more ridiculous, Jesus himself never thinks to tell Paul, the one clearly literate guy among these disbelieving, Lord-abandoning knuckleheads, to write this shit down. And this supernatural part of Jesus' ministry was a primary selling mechanism, according to people like Christian excuseist J. Warner Wallace. Right, J-Dubs?
What I was so intrigued by was the evidential nature of Jesus. The fact that he would always come into a city and provide evidence for belief and then preach behind that evidence. So for example, he would say often in the Gospel of John, if you don't believe what I'm telling you, at least believe on the evidence of the miracles I've offered you.
Paul never even mentioned the empty tomb, from which his Jesus allegedly rose. So there's another meme not yet posted in Paul's day. Despite having direct revelation from the Lord himself, despite meeting with the people who knew Jesus intimately according to the Gospels, Paul apparently knew only that Jesus was born of a virgin. No, not a virgin, a woman. He had brothers. He was made in the image of man and was cool with taxes. Did you hear that, my conservative Christian friends? Your God, of whom Paul knew almost nothing in terms of the miraculous, was supposedly okay with taxes. Come on, is that not the most ridiculous thing you've ever heard? Once again, I'm me. Thanks for watching.